Are we going to be disappointed once again, both in terms of the stimulus measures that they could deliver and how effective and productive they're going to be?
Yeah, well, I think we had a Politburo meeting in end of April, right? So back then the discussion was, demand was very weak, expectation is weakening, and also there's a supply side shock, from weakening exports as well. So I think this time around, the issue are more or less the same, except that, the urgency is imminent. So, we're expecting to see some more details on, some of the recent policies that has been rolled out. For example, I think late last week, there was an announcement about, redeveloping some of the older part of the urban center in many of the cities, and I think that would create some demand for property and trying to, help to stabilize the property sector. So I think, there are many things to do at this moment. We're being hit by weakening exports, very weak property sector, and also people are not spending as much.
Yeah, this is it, right? I'm just looking at these latest lines from the NDRC, encouraging REITs backed by projects with private investment, encouraging private investment to partake in construction projects as a part of the broader economic revival. I mean, how tempting would this be for private investors, given the debt burdens that we know already exist and the problems, the structural problems with the property sector now?
Yeah, I think right now, if you look at the credit growth this year, private sector is actually borrowing substantially less than the state-owned sectors, and also overall, the overall borrowing is lower than last year as well. And last year was a really low base to compare with. So I would say that right now it's not only about how the private sector is unwilling to borrow, but also whether they have the cash flow to borrow. For example, the property sector, right? So because the sales of property is slowing down, so it creates problem for property developers to recycle cash and put back into investments, stuff like that. So not only the expectation is weakening, but also people need the cash flow to sustain the debt load they already have on their balance sheet.
So external demand is weak, which means trade for China isn't really helping its economy. So where should they put their hopes for that boost in the economy?
Yeah, I think obviously consumption coupon, many people were calling for distribution of, cash or consumption coupon to residents. Obviously, the similar policies in overseas countries actually help to sustain the economy, during the pandemic years. But I think this is, even though this policy may make sense, but it's somehow being sort of disagreed by the top government officials. So I think, it's a remote hope. Besides that, property sector needs help, and also, the policy I discussed just now to redevelop some of the older part of some of the super large cities should help. To sustain the domestic demand to a certain extent.
Given what's coming and perhaps what's not coming from the government, what can we expect for the Chinese yuan?
Yeah, it's been weak. I mean, especially against the backdrop that Chinese exports is still creating a super large surplus months on months. So it's. Exports is weakening, and export is a sector that is not controlled by the domestic policy. All right, so, overall, because of the much of the Chinese production capacity were meant for the foreign demand, and therefore, you have a substantial downward pricing pressure on domestic prices, and that is why we're seeing persistent upstream deflation, and also CPI is close to zero. So in this environment, it creates pressure on the yuan. But fortunately, this week we're going to hear what the Fed is going to say about the U.S. interest policy, and if the Fed is close to the tightening cycle, and also the Chinese PBOC may be on the verge of acting more to pump more liquidity into the system, then it probably the pressure on the Chinese yuan will lessen from here. So the 7.3 level around there, should be a cyclical low for the Chinese yuan.
When you take a look at the time that it's taken for decision making and the sort of communication and drip feed we've seen from policymakers and authorities, How high is the hurdle for truly effective policy stimulus at this point, do you think?
Very high, very, very high. I mean, just now we discussed about, weakening domestic demand and, we're unwilling to distribute consumption coupon or cash to residents, right? So, because unemployment level is high, especially around amongst the younger generation, and also people's income is being hit, and all that. So the willingness to spend money is actually lower. So if you look at the Chinese household confidence by the PBOC survey, it is still, even though it has improved from a very low level, but it is still at historical low, right? So that is the reason why we are in urgent need for some policy stimulus, and hopefully we will see some more details in the upcoming meetings.
So, Hong, how closely do you think the PBOC is watching other central banks? And if the Fed and the ECB are expected to hike, how much leeway does this leave the Chinese central bank?
Yeah, well, I mean, fortunately, if you look at the domestic economy, we don't have inflationary pressure, right? So the picture in China is very different from, the foreign countries where, inflation pressure is still very high. So it creates room for the PBOC to act. And then at the same time, because the Fed is very close to the end of the tightening cycle, then it creates even more room for the PBOC to act. But I think right now the problem is not how low the interest rate is, because the interest rate is already, at a decade low right now. The problem is that, people borrow too much in the past few years and they can't borrow much more. And also, because of the cash flow is being hit, so that the ability to service the debt load is also very low as well. So, I think we need more creative monetary policy and also fiscal policy, to help sustain the economy.